Endgame by J.G. Ballard. Originally published in the June 1963 issue of New World's science fiction magazine. Republished 1 year later in a collection of short works by the author entitled Terminal Beach, and again in a 1968 anthology entitled SF Author's Choice, for which the editor, Harry Harrison, asked each author to provide commentary about their contributions. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel Quasar Spectra. Endgame. After his trial, they gave Constantine a villa, an allowance, and an executioner. The villa was small and high-walled, and had obviously been used for the purpose before. The allowance was adequate to Constantine's needs. He was never permitted to go out, and his meals were prepared for him by a police orderly. The executioner was his own. Most of the time they sat on the enclosed veranda, overlooking the narrow stone garden, playing chess with a set of large, well-worn pieces. The executioner's name was Malik. Officially, he was Constantine's supervisor and responsible for maintaining the villa's tenuous contact with the outside world, now hidden from sight beyond the steep walls, and for taking the brief telephone call that came promptly at 9 o'clock every morning. However, his real role was no secret between them. A powerful, doughy-faced man with an anonymous expression, Malik at first intensely irritated Constantine, who had been used to dealing with more subtle sets of responses. Malik impassively followed him around the villa, never interfering, unless Constantine tried to bribe the orderly for a prohibited newspaper, when Malik merely gestured with a slight turn of one of his large hands, face registering no disapproval, but cutting off the attempts as irrevocably as a bulkhead, nor making any suggestions as to how Constantine should spend his time. Like a large bear, he sat motionlessly in the lounge in one of the faded armchairs, watching Constantine. After a week, Constantine tired of reading the old novels in the bottom shelf of the bookcase. Somewhere among the gray, well-thumbed pages, he had hoped to find a message from one of his predecessors, and invited Malik to play chess. The set of chipped mahogany pieces reposed on one of the empty shelves of the bookcase, the only item of decoration or recreational equipment in the villa. Apart from the books and the chess set, the small six-roomed house was completely devoid of ornament. There were no curtains or picture rails beside tables or standard lamps, and the only electrical fittings were the lights recessed behind thick, opaque bowls into the ceilings. Obviously, the chess set and the row of novels had been provided deliberately, each representing one of the alternative pastimes available to the temporary tenants of the villa. Men of a phlegmatic or philosophical temperament, stoically resigned to the inevitability of their fate, would choose to read the novels, sinking backward into a self-anesthetized trance as they waded through the turgid prose of those 19th century romances. On the other hand, men of a more volatile and extrovert disposition would obviously choose the chess, unable to resist the opportunity to exercise their Machiavellian talents for positional maneuver to the last. The games of chess would help to maintain their unconscious optimism and, more subtly, sublimate or divert any attempts at escape. When Constantine suggested that they play chess, Malik promptly agreed, and so they spent the next long month as the late summer turned to autumn. Constantine was glad he had chosen chess. The game brought him into immediate personal involvement with Malik, and like all condemned men, he had soon developed a powerful emotional transference onto what effectively was the only person left in his life. At present, it was neither negative nor positive, but a relationship of acute dependence. Already Malik's notional personality was becoming overlaid by the associations of all the anonymous but nonetheless potent figures of authority whom Constantine could remember since his earliest childhood, his own father, the priest at the seminary he had seen hanged after the Revolution, the first senior commissars, the party secretaries at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and, ultimately, the members of the Central Committee themselves. Here, where the anonymous faces had crystallized into those of closely observed colleagues and rivals, the process seemed to come full circle, so that he himself was identified with those shadowy personas who had authorized his death and were now represented by Malik. Constantine had also, of course, become dominated by another obsession, the need to know when. In the weeks after the trial and sentence, he had remained in a curiously euphoric state, too stunned to realize that the dimension of time still existed for him. He had already died a posteriori, but gradually the will to live and his old determination and ruthlessness, which had served him so well for 30 years, reasserted themselves, and he realized that a small hope still remained to him. How long exactly in terms of time he could only guess, but if he could master Malik, his survival became a real possibility. The question remained, when? Fortunately, he could be completely frank with Malik, the first point he established immediately. "Malik," he asked on the 10th move one morning when he had completed his development and was relaxing for a moment, "tell me, do you know when?" Malik looked up from the board, his large, almost bovine eyes gazing blandly at Constantine. "Yes, Mr. Constantine, I know when." His voice was deep and functional, as expressionless as a weighing machine's. Constantine sat back reflectively. Outside the glass panes of the veranda, the rain fell steadily on the solitary fir tree which had maintained a precarious perch among the stones under the wall. A few miles to the southwest of the villa were the outskirts of the small port, one of the dismal so-called coastal resorts where junior ministry men and party hacks were sent for the biannual holidays. The weather, however, seemed peculiarly inclement, the sun never shining through the morose clouds, and for a moment, before he checked himself, Constantine felt glad to be within the comparative warmth of the villa. "Let me get this straight," he said to Malik. "You don't merely know in a general sense, for example, after receiving an instruction from so-and-so, but you know specifically when?" "Exactly." Malik moved his queen out of the game. His chess was sound, but without flair or a personal style, suggesting that he had improved merely by practice. Most of his opponents, Constantine realized with sardonic amusement, would have been players of a high class. "You know the day and the hour and the minute?" Constantine pressed. Malik nodded slowly, most of his attention upon the game, and Constantine rested his smooth, sharp chin in one hand, watching his opponent. "It could be within the next 10 seconds, or again, it might not be for 10 years?" "As you say." Malik gestured at the board. "Your move." Constantine waved this aside. "I know, but let's rush it. These games are played on many levels, Malik. People who talk about the three-dimensional chess obviously know nothing about the present form." Occasionally, he made these openings in the hope of loosening Malik's tongue, but conversation with him seemed to be impossible. Abruptly, he sat forward across the board, his eyes searching Malik's. "You alone know the date, Malik, and as you have said, it might not be for 10 years or 20. Do you think you can keep such a secret to yourself for so long?" Malik made no attempt to answer this and waited for Constantine to resume play. Now and then, His eyes inspected the corners of the veranda or glanced at the stone garden outside. From the kitchen came the occasional sounds of the orderly's boots scraping the floors as he lounged by the telephone on the deal table. As he scrutinized the board, Constantine wondered how he could provoke any response whatever from Malik. The man had shown no reaction at the mention of 10 years, although the period was ludicrously far ahead. In all probability, their real game would be a short one. The indeterminate date of the execution, which imbued the procedure with such a bizarre flavor, was not intended to add an element of torture or suspense to the condemned's last days, but simply to obscure and confuse the very fact of his exit. If a definite date were known in advance, there might be a last-minute rally of sympathy, an attempt to review the sentence, and perhaps apportion the blame elsewhere. And the unconscious, if not conscious, sense of complicity in the condemned man's crimes might well provoke an agonized reappraisal and, after the execution of the sentence, a submerged sense of guilt, upon which opportunists and intriguers could play to advantage. By means of the present system, however, all these dangers and unpleasant side effects were obviated. The accused was removed from his place in the hierarchy when the opposition to him was at its zenith and conveniently handed over to the judiciary, and thence to one of the courts of Star Chamber whose proceedings were always held in camera and whose verdicts were never announced. As far as his former colleagues were concerned, he had disappeared into the endless corridor world of the bureaucratic purgatories, his case permanently on file but never irrevocably closed. Above all, the fact of his guilt was never established and confirmed. As Constantine was aware, he himself had been convicted upon a technicality in the margins of the main indictment against him, a mere procedural device, like a bad twist in the plot of a story, designed solely to bring the investigation to a close. Although he knew the real nature of his crime, Constantine had never been formally notified of his guilt. In fact, the court had gone out of its way to avoid preferring any serious charges against him whatever. This ironic inversion of the classical Kafkaesque situation, by which, instead of admitting his guilt to a non-existent crime, he was forced to connive in a farce maintaining his innocence of offenses he knew full well he had committed, was preserved in his present situation at the execution villa. The psychological basis was more obscure, but in some way far more threatening, the executioner beckoning his victim toward him with a beguiling smile, reassuring him that all was forgiven. Here he played upon, not those unconscious feelings of anxiety and guilt, but that innate conviction of individual survival, that obsessive preoccupation with personal immortality, which is merely a disguised form of the universal fear of the image of one's own death. It was this assurance that all was well, and the absence of any charges of guilt or responsibility, which had made so orderly the queues into the gas chambers. At present, the paradoxical face of this diabolical device was worn by Malik, his lumpy, amorphous features and neutral but ambiguous attitude making him seem less a separate personality than the personification of the apparat of the state. Perhaps the sardonic title of supervisor was nearer the truth than had seemed at first sight, and that Malik's real role was simply to officiate, or at the most serve as moderator, at a trial by ordeal in which Constantine was his own accused, prosecutor, and judge. However, he reflected as he examined the board, aware of Malik's bulky presence across the pieces. This would imply that they had completely misjudged his own personality with its buoyancy and almost Gallic verve and panache. He, of all people, would be the last to take his own life in an orgy of self-confessed guilt. Not for him the neurotic suicide so loved of the Slav, As long as there were a way out, he would cheerfully shoulder any burden of guilt, tolerant of his own weaknesses, ready to shrug them off with a quip. This insouciance had always been his strongest ally. His eyes searched the board, roving down the open files of the queens and bishops, as if the answer to the pressing enigma were to be found in these polished corridors. When? His own estimate was 2 months. Almost certainly, and he had no fear here that he was rationalizing, it would not be within the next 2 or 3 days, nor even the next fortnight. Haste was always unseemly, quite apart from violating the whole purpose of the exercise. 2 months would see him safely into limbo, and be sufficiently long for the suspense to break him down and reveal any secret allies, sufficiently brief to fit his particular crime. 2 months? Not as long as he might have wished. As he translated his queen's bishop into play, Constantine began to map out his strategy for defeating Malik. The first task, obviously, was to discover when Malik was to carry out the execution, partly to give him peace of mind, but also to allow him to adjust the context of his escape. A physical leap to freedom over the wall would be pointless. Contacts had to be established, pressure brought to bear at various sensitive points in the hierarchy, paving the way for a reconsideration of his case. All this would take time. His thoughts were interrupted by the sharp movement of Malik's left hand across the board, followed by a guttural grunt. Surprised by the speed and economy with which Malik had moved his piece, as much as by the fact that he himself was in check, Constantine sat forward and examined his position with more care. He glanced with grudging respect at Malik, who had sat back as impassively as ever, the knight he had deftly taken on the edge of the table in front of him. His eyes watched Constantine with their usual untroubled calm, like those of an immensely patient governess, his great shoulders hidden within the bulky suiting. But for a moment, when he had leaned across the board, Constantine had seen the powerful extension and flexion of his shoulder musculature. "Don't look so smug, my dear Malik," Constantine said to himself with a wry smile. "At least I know now that you're left-handed." Malik had taken the knight with one hand, hooking the piece between the thick knuckles of his ring and center fingers, and then substituting his queen with a smart tap, a movement not easily performed in the center of the crowded board. Useful though the confirmation was, Constantine had noticed Malik apparently trying to conceal his left-handedness during their meals and when opening and closing the windows. He found this sinistral aspect of Malik's personality curiously disturbing, an indication that there would be nothing predictable about his opponent or the ensuing struggle of wits between them. Even Malik's apparent lack of sharp intelligence was belied by the astuteness of his last move. Constantine was playing white and had chosen the queen's gambit, assuming that the fluid situation invariably resulting from the opening would be to his advantage and allow him to get on with the more serious task of planning his escape. But Malik had avoided any possible errors, steadily consolidating his position, and had even managed to launch a counter-gambit, offering a knight-to-bishop exchange which would soon undermine Constantine's position if he accepted. "A good move, Malik," he commented, "but perhaps a little risky in the long run." Declining the exchange, he lamely blocked the checking queen with an interposed pawn. Malik stared stolidly at the board, his heavy policeman's face, with its almost square frame from one jaw angle to the other, betraying no sign of thought. His approach, Constantine reflected as he watched his opponent, would be that of the pragmatist, judging always by immediate capability rather than by any concealed intentions. As if confirming this diagnosis, Malik simply returned his queen to her former square, unwilling or unable to exploit the advantage he had gained, and satisfied by the captured piece. Bored by the lower key under which the game had descended and the prospect of similar games ahead, Constantine castled his king to safety. For some reason, obviously irrational, he assumed that Malik would not kill him in the middle of a game, particularly if he, Malik, were winning. He recognized that this was an unconscious reason for wanting to play chess in the first place, and had no doubt motivated the many others who had also sat with Malik on the veranda, listening to the late summer rain. Suppressing a sudden pang of fear, Constantine examined Malik's powerful hands protruding from his cuffs like two joints of meat. If Malik wanted to, he could probably kill Constantine with his bare hands. That raised a second question, almost as fascinating as the first. Malik, another point. Constantine sat back, searching in his pockets for imaginary cigarettes. None were allowed him. Forgive my curiosity, but I am an interested party, as it were. He flashed Malik his brightest smile, a characteristically incisive thrust modulated by ironic self-deprecation, which had been so successful with his secretaries and at ministry receptions, but the essay at humor failed to move Malik. Tell me, do you know how? Searching for some euphemism, he repeated, "Do you know how you are going to—" and then gave up the attempt, cursing Malik to himself for lacking the social grace to rescue him from his awkwardness. Malik's chin rose slightly, a minimal nod. He showed no signs of being bored or irritated by Constantine's labored catechism, or of having noticed his embarrassment. "What is it, then?" Constantine pressed, recovering himself. "Pistol, pill, or—" With a harsh laugh, he pointed through the window. "Do you set up a guillotine in the rain? I'd like to know." Malik looked down at the chessboard, his features more glutinous and dough-like than ever. Flatly, he said, "It has been decided." Constantine snorted. "What on earth does that mean?" he snapped belligerently. "Is it painless?" For once, Malik smiled. A thin sneer of amusement hung fleetingly around his mouth. "Have you ever killed anything, Mr. Constantine?" he asked quietly. "Yourself personally, I mean." "Touché," Constantine granted. He laughed deliberately, trying to dispel the tension. "A perfect reply." To himself, he said, "I mustn't let curiosity get the upper hand. The man was laughing at me." "Of course," he went on, "death is always painful. I merely wondered whether, in the legal sense of the term, it would be humane. But I can see that you're a professional, Malik, and the question answers itself. A great relief, believe me. There are so many sadists about, perverts and the like." Again, he watched carefully to see if the implied sneer provoked Malik. "That one can't be too grateful for a clean curtain fall. It's good to know. I can devote these last days to putting my affairs in order and coming to terms with the world. If only I knew how long there was left, I could make my preparations accordingly. One can't be forever saying one's last prayers. You see my point?" Colorlessly, Malik said, "The prosecutor general advised you to make your final arrangements immediately after the trial." "But what does that mean?" Constantine asked, pitching his voice a calculated octave higher. I'm a human being, not a bookkeeper's ledger that can be totted up and left to await the auditor's pleasure. I wonder if you realize, Malik, the courage this situation demands from me. It's easy for you to sit there. Abruptly, Malik stood up, sending a shiver of terror through Constantine. With a glance at the sealed windows, he moved around the chess table toward the lounge. "We will postpone the game," he said. Nodding to Constantine, he went off toward the kitchen, where the orderly was preparing lunch. Constantine listened to his shoes squeaking faintly across the unpolished floor, then irritably cleared the pieces off the board and sat back with the black king in his hand. At least he had provoked Malik into leaving him. Thinking this over, he wondered whether to throw caution to the winds and began to make life intolerable for Malik. It would be easy to pursue him around the villa, arguing hysterically and badgering him with neurotic questions. Sooner or later, Malik would snap back and might give away something of his intentions. Alternatively, Constantine could try to freeze him out, treating him with contempt as the hired killer he was, refusing to share a room or his meals with him, and insisting on his rights as a former member of the Central Committee. The method might well be successful. Almost certainly Malik was telling the truth when he said he knew the exact day and minute of Constantine's execution. The order would have been given to him, and he would have no discretion to advance or delay the date to suit himself. Malik would be reluctant to report Constantine for difficult behavior. The reflection on himself was too obvious, and his present post was not one from which he could graciously retire. And in addition, not even the police president would be able to vary the execution date, now that it had been set without convening several meetings. There was then the danger of reopening Constantine's case. He was not without his allies, or at least those who were prepared to use him for their own advantage. But despite these considerations, the whole business of play acting lacked appeal for Constantine. His approach was more serpentine. Besides, if he provoked Malik, uncertainties were introduced, of which there were already far too many. He noticed the supervisor enter the lounge and sit down quietly in one of the gray armchairs, his face, half hidden in the shadows, turned toward Constantine. He seemed indifferent to the normal pressures of boredom and fatigue. Luckily for himself, Constantine reflected, an impatient man would have pulled the trigger on the morning of the second day. And content to sit about in the armchair, watching Constantine as the gray rain fell outside and damp leaves gathered against the walls. The difficulties of establishing a relationship with Malik, and some sort of relationship was essential before Constantine could begin to think of escape, seemed insuperable, only the games of chess offering an opportunity. Placing the Black King on his own king's square, Constantine called out, "Malik, I'm ready for another game, if you are." Malik pushed himself out of the chair with his long arms, and then took his place across the board from Constantine. For a moment he scrutinized Constantine with a level glance, as if ascertaining that there would be no further outbursts of temper, and then began to set up the white pieces, apparently prepared to ignore the fact that Constantine had cleared the previous game before its completion. He opened with a stolid Ruy Lopez, an overanalyzed and uninteresting attack, but a dozen moves later, when they broke off for lunch, he had already forced Constantine to castle on the queen's side and had established a powerful position in the center. As they took their lunch together at the card table behind the sofa in the lounge, Constantine reflected upon this curious element which had been introduced into his relationship with Malik. While trying to check any tendency to magnify an insignificant triviality into a major symbol, he realized that Malik's proficiency at chess and his ability to produce powerful combinations out of pedestrian openings was symptomatic of his concealed power over Constantine. The drab villa in the thin autumn rain, the faded furniture and unimaginative food they were now mechanically consuming, the whole gray limbo with its slender telephone connection with the outside world, were, like his chess, exact extensions of Malik's personality, yet permeated with secret passages and doors. The unexpected thrived in such an ambiance. At any moment, as he shaved, the mirror might retract to reveal the flaming muzzle of a machine pistol, or the slightly bitter flavor of the soup they were drinking might be other than that of lentils. These thoughts preoccupied him as the afternoon light began to fade in the east, the white rectangle of the garden wall illuminated against this dim backdrop like a huge tabula rasa. Excusing himself from the chess game, Constantine feigned a headache and retired to his room upstairs. The door between his room and Malik's had been removed, and as he lay on the bed he was conscious of the supervisor sitting in his chair with his back to the window. Perhaps it was Malik's presence which prevented him from gaining any real rest, and when he rose several hours later and returned to the veranda, he felt tired and possessed by a deepening sense of foreboding. With an effort, he rallied his spirits, and by concentrating his whole attention on the game, was able to extract what appeared to be a drawn position. Although the game was adjourned without comment from either player, Malik seemed to concede by his manner that he had lost his advantage, lingering for a perceptible moment over the board when Constantine rose from the table. The lesson of all this was not lost to Constantine the following day. He was fully aware that the games of chess were not only taxing his energies, but providing Malik with a greater hold upon himself than he upon Malik. Although the pieces stood where they had left them the previous evening, Constantine did not suggest that they resume play. Malik made no move toward the board, apparently indifferent to whether the game was finished or not. Most of the time he sat next to Constantine by the single radiator in the lounge, occasionally going off to confer with the orderly in the kitchen. As usual, the telephone rang briefly each morning, but otherwise there were no callers or visitors to the villa. To all intents it remained suspended in a perfect vacuum. It was this unvarying nature of their daily routines which Constantine found particularly depressing. Intermittently, over the next few days, he played chess with Malik, invariably finding himself in a losing position, but the focus of his attention was elsewhere, upon the enigma cloaked by Malik's square, expressionless face. Around him, 1,000 invisible clocks raced onward toward their beckoning zeros, a soundless thunder like the drumming of apocalyptic hoof-irons. His mood of foreboding had given way to one of mounting fear, all the more terrifying because, despite Malik's real role, it seemed completely sourceless. He found himself unable to concentrate for more than a few minutes upon any task, left his meals unfinished, and fidgeted helplessly by the veranda window. The slightest movement by Malik would make his nerves thrill with anguish. If the supervisor left his customary seat in the lounge to speak to the orderly, Constantine would find himself almost paralyzed by the tension, helplessly counting the seconds until Malik returned. Once, during one of their meals, Malik started to ask him for the salt, and Constantine almost choked to death. The ironic humor of this near fatality reminded Constantine that almost half of his 2-month sentence had elapsed. But his crude attempts to obtain a pencil from the orderly and, later, failing this, to mark the letters in a page torn from one of the novels were intercepted by Malik, and he realized that, short of defeating the 2 policemen in single-handed combat, he had no means of escaping his ever more imminent fate. Latterly, he noticed that Malik's movements and general activity around the villa seemed to have quickened. He still sat for long periods in the armchair, observing Constantine, but his formerly impassive presence was graced by gestures and inclinations of the head that seemed to reflect a heightened cerebral activity, as if he were preparing himself for some long-awaited denouement. Even the heavy musculature of his face seemed to have relaxed and grown sleeker, his sharp, mobile eyes, like those of an experienced senior inspector of police, roving constantly about the rooms. Despite his efforts, however, Constantine was unable to galvanize himself into any defensive action. He could see clearly that Malik and himself had entered a new phase in their relationship, and that at any moment their outwardly formal and polite behavior would degenerate into gasping, ugly violence, but he was none the less immobilized by his own state of terror. The days passed in a blur of uneaten meals and abandoned chess games, their very identity blotting out any sense of time or progression, the watching figure of Malik always before him. Every morning, when he woke after 2 or 3 hours of sleep to find his consciousness still intact, a discovery almost painful in its relief and poignancy, he would be immediately aware of Malik standing in the next room, then waiting discreetly in the hallway as Constantine shaved in the bathroom, also without its door, following him downstairs to breakfast, his careful, reflective tread like that of a hangman descending from his gallows. After breakfast, Constantine would challenge Malik to a game of chess, but after a few moves would begin to play wildly, throwing pieces forward to be decimated by Malik. At times, the supervisor would glance curiously at Constantine as if wondering whether his charge had lost his reason, and then continued to play his careful, exact game, invariably winning or drawing. Dimly, Constantine perceived that, by losing to Malik, he had also surrendered to him psychologically, but the games had now become simply a means of passing the unending days. 6 weeks after they had first begun to play chess, Constantine, more by luck than skill, succeeded in an extravagant pawn gambit and forced Malik to sacrifice both his center and any possibility of castling. Roused from his state of numb anxiety by this temporary victory, Constantine sat forward over the board, irritably waving away the orderly who announced from the door of the lounge that he would serve lunch. "Tell him to wait, Malik. I mustn't lose my concentration at this point. I've very nearly won the game." "Well..." Malik glanced at his watch, then over his shoulder at the orderly, who, however, had turned on his heel and returned to the kitchen. He started to stand up. "It can wait. He's bringing the..." "No!" Constantine snapped. "Just give me 5 minutes. Malik, damn it, one adjourns on a move, not halfway through it." "Very well." Malik hesitated, after a further glance at his watch. He climbed to his feet. "I will tell him." Constantine concentrated on the board, ignoring the supervisor's retreating figure, the scent of victory clearing his mind. But 30 seconds later, he sat up with a start, his heart almost stopping inside his chest. Malik had gone upstairs. Constantine distinctly remembered him saying he would tell the orderly to delay lunch, but instead he had walked straight up to his bedroom. Not only was it extremely unusual for Constantine to be left unobserved when the orderly was otherwise occupied, but the latter had still not brought in their first luncheon course. Steadying the table, Constantine stood up, his eyes searching the open doorways in front and behind him. Almost certainly the orderly's announcement of lunch was a signal, and Malik had found a convenient pretext for going upstairs to prepare his execution weapon. Faced at last by the imminent nemesis he had so long dreaded, Constantine listened for the sounds of Malik's feet descending the staircase. A profound silence enclosed the villa, broken only by the fall of one of the chess pieces to the tiled floor. Outside, the sun shone intermittently in the garden, illuminating the broken flagstones of the ornamental pathway and the bare 15-foot high face of the walls. A few stunted weeds flowered among the rubble, their pale colors blanched by the sunlight, and Constantine was suddenly filled by an overwhelming need to escape into the open air for the few last moments before he died. The east wall, lit by the sun's rays, was marked by a faint series of horizontal grooves, the remnants, perhaps, of a fire escape ladder, and the slender possibility of using these as handholds made the enclosed garden a perfect killing ground, preferable to the frantic claustrophobic nexus of the villa. Above him, Malik's measured tread moved across the ceiling to the head of the staircase. He paused there and then began to descend the stairs, his steps chosen with a precise and careful rhythm. Helplessly, Constantine searched the veranda for something that would serve as a weapon. The French windows onto the garden were locked, and a slotted pinion outside secured the left-hand member of the pair to the edge of the sill. If this were raised, there was a chance that the windows could be forced outward. Scattering the chess pieces onto the floor with a sweep of his hand, Constantine seized the board and folded it together, then stepped over to the window and drove the heavy wooden box through the bottom pane. The report of the bursting glass echoed like a gunshot through the villa. Kneeling down, he pushed his hand through the aperture and tried to lift the pinion, jerking it up and down in its rusty socket. When it failed to clear the sill, he forced his head through the broken window and began to heave against it helplessly with his thin shoulders, the fragments of broken glass falling onto his neck. Behind him, a chair was kicked back, and he felt two powerful hands seize his shoulders and pull him away from the window. He struck out hysterically with the chess box, and then was flung headfirst to the tiled floor. His convalescence from this episode was to last most of the following week. For the first 3 days, he remained in bed, recovering his physical identity, waiting for the sprained muscles of his hands and shoulders to repair themselves. When he felt sufficiently strong to leave his bed, he went down to the lounge and sat at one end of the sofa, his back to the windows and the thin autumn light. Malik still remained in attendance, and the orderly prepared his meals as before. Neither of them made any comment upon Constantine's outburst of hysteria, or indeed betrayed any signs that it had taken place, but Constantine realized that he had crossed an important Rubicon. His whole relationship with Malik had experienced a profound change. The fear of his own imminent death and the tantalizing mystery of its precise date, which had so obsessed him, had been replaced by a calm acceptance that the judicial processes inaugurated by his trial would take their course, and that Malik and the orderly were merely the local agents of this distant apparat. In a sense, his sentence and present tenuous existence at the villa were a microcosm of life itself, with its inherent but unfeared uncertainties, its inevitable quietus to be made on a date never known in advance. Seeing his role at the villa in this light, Constantine no longer felt afraid at the prospect of his own extinction, fully aware that a change in the political wind could win him a free pardon. In addition, he realized that Malik, far from being his executioner, a purely formal role, was in fact an intermediary between himself and the hierarchy, and in an important sense a potential ally of Constantine's. As he reformed his defense against the indictment preferred against him at the trial, he knew he had been far too willing to accept the fait accompli of his own guilt. He calculated the various ways in which Malik would be able to assist him. There was no doubt in his mind that he had misjudged Malik. With his sharp intelligence and commanding presence, the supervisor was very far from being a hatchet-faced killer. This original impression had been the result of some cloudiness in Constantine's perceptions, an unfortunate myopia which had cost him 2 precious months in his task of arranging a retrial. Comfortably swathed in his dressing gown, he sat at the card table in the lounge. They had abandoned the veranda with the colder weather, and only a patch of brown paper over the window reminded him of that first circle of purgatory. Concentrating on the game of chess, Malik sat opposite him, hands clasped on one knee, his thumbs occasionally circling as he pondered a move. Although no less reticent than he had ever been, his manner seemed to indicate that he understood and confirmed Constantine's reappraisal of the situation. He still followed Constantine around the villa, but his attentions were noticeably more perfunctory, as if he realized that Constantine would not try again to escape. From the start, Constantine was completely frank with Malik. "I am convinced, Malik, that the prosecutor general was misdirected by the Justice Department, and that the whole basis of the trial was a false one. All but one of the indictments were never formally presented, so I had no opportunity to defend myself. You understand that, Malik? The selection of the capital penalty for one count was purely arbitrary." Malik nodded, moving a piece. "So you have explained, Mr. Constantine. I am afraid I do not have a legalistic turn of mind." "There's no need for you to," Constantine assured him. "The point is obvious. I hope it may be possible to appeal against the court's decision and ask for a retrial." Constantine gestured with a piece. "I criticize myself for accepting the indictment so readily. In effect, I made no attempt to defend myself. If only I had done so, I am convinced I should have been found innocent." Malik murmured noncommittally and gestured toward the board. Constantine resumed play. Most of the games he consistently lost to Malik, but this no longer troubled him and, if anything, only served to reinforce the bonds between them. Constantine had decided not to ask the supervisor to inform the Justice Department of his request for a retrial until he had convinced Malik that his case left substantial room for doubt. A premature application would meet with an automatic negative from Malik, whatever his private sympathies. Conversely, once Malik was firmly on his side, he would be prepared to risk his reputation with his seniors, and indeed his championing of Constantine's cause would be convincing proof in itself of the latter's innocence. As Constantine soon found from his one-sided discussions with Malik, arguing over the legal technicalities of the trial with their infinitely subtle nuances and implications was an unprofitable method of enlisting Malik's support, and he realized that he would have to do so by sheer impress of personality, by his manner, bearing, and general conduct, and above all by his confidence of his innocence in the face of the penalty which might at any moment be imposed upon him. Curiously, this latter pose was not as difficult to maintain as might have been expected. Constantine already felt a surge of conviction in his eventual escape from the villa. Sooner or later, Malik would recognize the authenticity of this inner confidence. To begin with, however, the supervisor remained his usual phlegmatic self. Constantine talked away at him from morning to evening, every third word affirming the probability of his being found innocent. But Malik merely nodded with a faint smile and continued to play his errorless chess. "Malik, I don't want you to think that I challenge the competence of the court to try the charges against me, or that I hold it in disrespect," he said to the supervisor as they played their usual morning board some 2 weeks after the incident on the veranda. "Far from it, but the court must make its decisions within the context of the evidence presented by the prosecutor, and even then the greatest imponderable remains the role of the accused. In my case, I was, to all intents, not present at the trial, so my innocence is established by force majeure. Don't you agree, Malik?" Malik's eyes searched the pieces on the board, his lips pursing thinly. "I'm afraid this is above my head, Mr. Constantine. Naturally, I accept the authority of the court without question." "But so do I, Malik. I've made that plain. The real question is simply whether the verdict was justified in the light of the new circumstances I'm describing." Malik shrugged, apparently more interested in the end game before them. "I recommend you to accept the verdict, Mr. Constantine. For your peace of mind, you understand." Constantine looked away with a gesture of impatience. "I don't agree, Malik. Besides, a great deal is at stake." He glanced up at the windows, which were drumming in the cold autumn wind. The casements were slightly loose, and the air lanced around them. The villa was poorly heated, only the single radiator in the lounge warming the 3 rooms downstairs. Already Constantine dreaded the winter. His hands and feet were perpetually cold, and he could find no means of warming them. "Malik, is there any chance of obtaining another heater?" he asked. "It's none too warm in here. I've a feeling it's going to be a particularly cold winter." Malik looked up from the board, his bland gray eyes regarding Constantine with a flicker of curiosity, as if this last remark were one of the few he had heard from Constantine's lips which contained any overtones whatever. "It is cold," he agreed at last. "I will see if I can borrow a heater. This villa is closed for most of the year." Constantine pestered him for news of the heater during the following week, partly because the success of his request would have symbolized Malik's first concession to him, but it failed to materialize. After one palpably lame excuse, Malik merely ignored his further reminders. Outside, in the garden, the leaves whirled about the stones in a vortex of chilling air, and overhead the low clouds raced seaward. The 2 men in the lounge hunched over their chessboard by the radiator, hands buried in their pockets between moves. Perhaps it was this darkening weather which made Constantine impatient of Malik's slowness in seeing the point of his argument, and he made his first suggestions that Malik should transmit a formal request for a retrial to his superiors at the Department of Justice. "You speak to someone on the telephone every morning, Malik," he pointed out when Malik demurred. "There's no difficulty involved. If you're afraid of compromising yourself, though I would have thought that a small price to pay in view of what is at stake, the orderly can pass on a message." "It's not feasible, Mr. Constantine." Malik seemed at last to be tiring of the subject. "I suggest that you—" "Malik!" Constantine stood up and paced around the lounge. "Don't you realize that you must? You're literally my only means of contact. If you refuse, I'm absolutely powerless. There's no hope of getting a reprieve." "The trial has already taken place, Mr. Constantine," Malik pointed out patiently. "It was a mistrial. Don't you understand, Malik? I accepted that I was guilty when, in fact, I was completely innocent." Malik looked up from the board, his eyebrows lifting. "Completely innocent, Mr. Constantine?" Constantine snapped his fingers. "Well, virtually innocent, at least in terms of the indictment and trial." "But that is merely a tactical difference, Mr. Constantine. The Department of Justice is concerned with absolutes." "Quite right, Malik. I agree entirely." Constantine nodded approvingly at the supervisor and privately noted his quizzical expression, the first time Malik had displayed a taste for irony. He was to notice this fresh leitmotif recurring during the next days, Whenever he raised the subject of his request for a retrial, Malik would counter with one of his deceptively naive queries, trying to establish some minor tangential point, almost as if he were leading Constantine on to a fuller admission. At first, Constantine assumed that the supervisor was fishing for information about other members of the hierarchy which he wished to use for his own purposes, but the few tidbits he offered were ignored by Malik, and it dawned upon him that Malik was genuinely interested in establishing the sincerity of Constantine's conviction of his own innocence. He showed no signs, however, of being prepared to contact his superiors at the Department of Justice, and Constantine's impatience continued to mount. He now used their morning and afternoon chess sessions as an opportunity to hold forth at length on the subject of the shortcomings of the judicial system, using his own case as an illustration, and hammered away at the theme of his innocence, even hinting that Malik might find himself held responsible if, by any mischance, he was not granted a reprieve. "The position I find myself in is really most extraordinary," he told Malik almost exactly 2 months after his arrival at the villa. "Everyone else is satisfied with the court's verdict, and yet I alone know that I am innocent. I feel very like someone who is about to be buried alive." Malik managed a thin smile across the chess pieces. "Of course, Mr. Constantine, it is possible to convince oneself of anything given a sufficient incentive." "But Malik, I assure you," Constantine insisted, ignoring the board and concentrating his whole attention upon the supervisor, "this is no death cell repentance. Believe me, I know. I have examined the entire case from 1,000 perspectives, questioned every possible motive. There is no doubt in my mind. I may once have been prepared to accept the possibility of my guilt, but I realize now that I was entirely mistaken. Experience encourages us to take too great a responsibility for ourselves. When we fall short of our ideals, we become critical of ourselves and ready to assume that we are at fault. How dangerous that can be, Malik, I now know. Only the truly innocent man can really understand the meaning of guilt." Constantine stopped and sat back, a slight weariness overtaking him in the cold room. Malik was nodding slowly, a thin and not altogether unsympathetic smile on his lips, as if he understood everything Constantine had said. Then he moved a piece, and with a murmured, "Excuse me," left his seat and went out of the room. Drawing the lapels of the dressing gown around his chest, Constantine studied the board with a desultory eye. He noticed that Malik's move appeared to be the first bad one he had made in all their games together, but he felt too tired to make the most of his opportunity. His brief speech to Malik, confirming all he believed, now left nothing more to be said. From now on, whatever happened was up to Malik. "Mr. Constantine." He turned in his chair and, to his surprise, saw the supervisor standing in the doorway wearing his long gray overcoat. "Malik?" For a moment, Constantine felt his heart gallop, and then controlled himself. "Malik, you've agreed at last? You're going to take me to the department?" Malik shook his head, his eyes staring somberly at Constantine. "Not exactly. I thought we might look at the garden, Mr. Constantine. A breath of fresh air, it will do you good." "Of course, Malik, it's kind of you." Constantine rose a little unsteadily to his feet and tightened the cord of his dressing gown. "Pardon my wild hopes." He tried to smile at Malik, but the supervisor stood impassively by the door, hands in his overcoat pockets, his eyes lowered fractionally from Constantine's face. They went onto the veranda toward the French windows. Outside, the cold morning air whirled in frantic circles around the small stone yard, the leaves spiraling upward into the dark sky. To Constantine there seemed little point in going out into the garden, but Malik stood behind him, one hand on the latch. Malik. Something made him turn and face the supervisor. You do understand what I mean when I say I am absolutely innocent. I know that. Of course, Mr. Constantine. The supervisor's face was relaxed and almost genial. I understand. When you know you are innocent, then you are guilty. His hand opened the veranda door onto the whirling leaves. Comment on Endgame. The psychology of guilt and rebellion is barely looked at by science fiction. By and large, a literature of optimism, and much the worse for it, science fiction assumes that the chief obstacles in the way of human liberty and progress are faults in social and political institutions, and that once these have been corrected, a millennial age will dawn. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth. At the best and worst of times, it is difficult to know on which side of the bars we are, for the simple reason that we can never be sure on which side we want to be. These inversions, one of which Endgame illustrates, can take place within a society, an institution, or even a marriage. During the Second World War, I was interned with some 2,000 British and American civilians in a Japanese prison camp 10 miles from Shanghai. For most of the 3-year period, the camp was guarded by no more than a dozen Japanese. Apart from a few atrocities committed during the last months of the war, the main energies of the guards were devoted to helping the inmates strengthen the barbed wire fence which kept out the starving Chinese trying to get into the camp and share the vegetables grown there on every square inch of available soil. Roll calls, curfews, and the like were organized by the inmates. The guards barely put in an appearance, realizing that, left to themselves, the inmates would devise a more regimented and impregnable prison within a prison than any they could hope for. 3 weeks after the war ended, I walked back to the camp along the Shanghai-Nanking railway line. At a small wayside station, an abandoned platoon of Japanese soldiers were squatting on the platform, watching one of their number string up a Chinese youth with telephone wire. 400 yards away on a tank trap embankment, a group of Kuomintang allied Chinese troops were feeding themselves on the Spam and Nescafe misdropped by the B-29s 3 miles from the camp. Neither of these groups did more than look at me as I walked past. When I reached the camp, I found the gates guarded by an American merchant sailor with a Mauser on his hip. Although he had lived in the camp with me for 3 years, he apparently failed to recognize me, and for half an hour I was unable even to convince him that I was English, let alone get in. The remaining inmates, some 600 in number, had formed an authoritarian regime with a camp commander, block leaders, and so on, and supported themselves by armed forays to retrieve the B-29 food canisters in the surrounding paddy fields. 6 months later, I was told that they were still there. The situation in Endgame reflects ambiguities and motives of a similar kind, although in a more domestic and confined context. Here, questions of guilt and responsibility complicate matters. In passing, it occurs to me that the psychology of civilian internees during wartime would make an interesting study. Unlike military personnel, the only reason for their long terms of imprisonment, during which they have to undergo sustained periods of hunger, abuse, and their own company, is the national crime of being enemy nationals. They suffer a wholly abstract form of imprisonment. Constantine, the convicted hero of Endgame, begins by accepting the fact of his guilt. A true child of the 20th century, he has no doubts whatever about the justice, both moral and legal, of his trial and impending execution. Unlike the heroes of Kafka's Trial and Metamorphosis, who at least begin by assuming their innocence and rebel against the nightmares in which they find themselves, Constantine accepts his situation completely. At first, his plans to escape are concerned with his own physical survival, but later he conceives of the moral notion of his own innocence. Imperceptibly, the failed political opportunist transforms himself into a martyr to his own innocence, a credo which he erects into a cathedral. Constantine is now an internal escapee. It is Constantine's absolute conviction of his innocence for which Malik, his executioner, is waiting. Only a truly innocent man can know the meaning of guilt, Constantine remarks, but Malik knows full well that the reverse is true. Only a truly guilty man can conceive of the concept of innocence at all, or hold it with such ferocity. Perhaps I have misread my own story, and its real significance, if any, may lie in another direction altogether. Nonetheless, it seems to me that a significant moral and psychological distance now separates us from Kafka's heroes, who succumbed in the end to their own unconscious feelings of guilt and inferiority. We, by contrast, in an age of optimism and promise, may fall equal victims to our notions of freedom, sanity, and self-sufficiency. J. G. Ballard.